And so with that, I want to turn the floor over to Dr. Anver Emon. Dr. Emon is the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, where he serves as professor in the Faculty of Law in the Department of History. Dr. Emon is also the Canada Research Chair in Islamic Law and History and one of the principal investigators in the Reading Muslims project. Dr. Emon's extensive research career focuses on pre-modern and modern Islamic legal history and theory, pre-modern modes of governance and education, and the role of Sharia both inside and outside the Muslim world. He's been thinking about and writing about the relationship between Islam and textuality for many years now, and we're grateful for the chance to hear his insights on this theme today. Dr. Emon, I turn the floor to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. We're really delighted to have such a wonderful group of people to inaugurate this project, and I want to thank Jude for agreeing to facilitate the conversation. So thank you. She's calling us in from the UAE, so time zones notwithstanding, we're here to be together. So thank you all for joining us. First, I want to begin by thanking all of you for taking the time out of your days. It's a Thursday. I'm sure there's lots of things you could be doing, but to be here to join us on the launch of this project is it's really welcome, and I want to thank many of you for being here. Some of you I know, we've worked long and hard with each other. We've gotten to know each other over the years. Others are new to me, and so I welcome your reaching out and look forward to your ongoing participation in the project. So how did Reading Muslims come about? It came about actually in a reading group that Youssef and I were developing here at the Institute. Ruba Kana'an was part of that. Moumtaz was part of that. It was focused on Islamic law and studies in Islamic law, but it really expanded. Ruba, as many will know, thinks a lot about material culture and art and does some fascinating work around the legal implications around it. Nada, of course, thinks about the Alkoff structure. She thinks about it in the context of urban planning and design. And together, we and many other colleagues were exploring what could a project on Islamic law look like and become. But at the same time, at the Institute of Islamic Studies, we were developing new ventures. We were thinking with the Aga Khan Museum and the Royal Ontario Museum around art and Islamic art history. We're also contending with the national security mandates around anti-terrorism financing in Canada, the US, and Europe. We also began seeing how Muslims and Islam became tropes of political development, political argument, intellectual campaigns across many countries. And my own work began to move from the medieval to the modern and thinking about how even the way we periodize in history departments needs to be rethought when we think about not just simply Islam or Islamic studies, but more particularly the way we deploy the textual tradition of Islam for different purposes, whether it's terrorism prosecutions by the government, looking for special intents on terrorist ideas, or the idea of what it means to be Muslim in an evolving context. And so it was also an opportunity to think about Canada at a time when we saw the United States under then Trump moving in one direction, much of Europe also moving in a similar direction with the rise of illiberal democracies. Canada also stood out as a country that is not neatly that is not oftentimes figured in the larger conversation or in the production of knowledge on Islam. It oftentimes gets amalgamated with the US in this ambiguous frame of North America, and oftentimes is footnote in that context. But we also felt that using Toronto, the city, with its diversity and its demographics as a location from which to launch a project like this could offer a unique opportunity to explore a number of themes around Islam and Islamic studies, especially at a university as wide-ranging, diverse, and frankly as big as the University of Toronto is, made up of 3 different campuses, and with its roughly 30 to 40 faculty members across those 3 campuses who do something in the study of Islam and Muslims. So Reading Muslims is an attempt to bring these people together here at U of T, connect us with the larger world, and convene a robust conversation that centers textuality and the way in which it gets deployed in a variety of contexts, medieval, modern, and future-oriented. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jude. And before I do them, I just want to also acknowledge that this project is funded by the University of Toronto's Kana'an Secretariat as a Kana'an Global Challenge Grant. And so we're really grateful for all the support from the university for helping us launch this project into the present and the future. So Jude, thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Emon. So with that, I want to introduce our remaining guests today. So first we have Dr. Ruba Kana'an. Dr. Ruba is an assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture at the University of Toronto. Dr. Kana'an is interested in questions about the formation and meanings of mosque architecture, metalwork, and civic space in pre-modern Muslim societies and contemporary contexts. Her most recent work explores the history of the Friday Mosque and the development of its symbolism by examining the extensive legal debates concerning Friday prayer. This project is the subject of a monograph entitled The Friday Mosque, Law, Architecture, and Authority in Pre-Modern Muslim Societies, which will be published by Edinburgh University Press in 2022. Dr. Neda Moumtaz serves as assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Department for the Study of Religion and Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations. Her work stands at the intersection of Islamic legal studies, the anthropology of Islam, and studies of capitalism, spanning the 19th and 21st centuries in the Levant. Her current research examines the contemporary Islamic revival of a centuries-old charitable practice of pious endowment, known as waqfs, under global capitalism and a regime of modern nation-states. This project is the subject of Dr. Moumtaz's first book, entitled God's Property. Dr. Youssef Sufi is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto's Institute of Islamic Studies, where he leads, along with Dr. Emon, the Reading Muslims project, on the history of Islamic legal theory and the historical evolution of substantive law. He's currently working on 2 forthcoming book projects. The first, based on his dissertation, traces the emergence of classical debate gatherings in Iraq and Persia between the 10th and 13th centuries. The second, inspired by his work at the Institute of Islamic Studies, analyzes Islamophobia and state surveillance in the post-9/11 period. All our speakers today are closely involved with the Reading Muslims project, leading and participating in its many hubs. On behalf of myself and the audience, I want to thank them all for joining us today. And so now I want to turn to the central themes we'll be exploring today. The question of what is Islam has been a lasting one in the field of Islamic studies, and it seems that every decade is associated with particular theorists who have made a lasting contribution to how we approach the subject of inquiry. We can think of Marshall Hodgson in the 70s, Talal Asad in the 80s, up until Shahab Ahmed's most recent intervention. Texts and textuality play a central role in these discussions. The question of texts' relationships to Islam shapes our scholarly methodologies across disciplines. At times, texts are approached as the privileged site of competing visions of Islam. At others, they serve as an archive for understanding past Muslim communities. Texts can also be a means for analyzing Muslim practice today, gesturing towards the longevity of texts and the pluritemporal interpretations that they engender. These methodological divides are rife with and fraught with questions of power. Which power relations enabled the production, transmission, reception, and interpretation of these texts? Which voices were silenced or marginalized? Who reads these texts today, both within and outside the academy? What assumptions do readers bring with them? And what kinds of violence might they engender? With these questions in mind, I want to turn to our panelists and ask them what makes a text Islamic in their respective disciplines and research foci. What histories account for their use of these texts? How do they seek to critically interrogate their methods to become more attuned to questions of power? So if we maybe can proceed in alphabetical order, starting with Dr. Emon, and then followed by Dr. Kana'an, Dr. Moumtaz, and conclude with Dr. Sufi. And if I could ask you all to keep your comments between 8 to 10 minutes so we have plenty of time for conversation and then questions. So Dr. Emon.
Sure, thank you. So, as the Reading Muslims project took shape, what became clear is that we needed to think about the way text became deployed across different sort of spaces. And so as an organizational matter, each of us speaks to different hubs. And so while I work with Youssef on managing the whole, the hub that I'm particularly interested in is the Reading Practices Group. It's a hub led by Suzanne Akbari, Jeannie Miller, and Haytham Bahura, but all of whom are colleagues here. And it really comes out of a larger conversation around the history of textual readings and how we think about the centrality or not of the textual tradition in the way we think about Islam and Muslims today. Suzanne Akbari, as many of you know, is a celebrated scholar of medieval studies, now at the Institute for Advanced Studies in New Jersey. Jeannie Miller is a professor in our own Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations department and brings considerable energy, enthusiasm, and insight into the study of medieval Arabic literature. Haytham Bahura, as our colleague in comparative literature and in the comparative lit department, and has been an immense interlocutor for me, shedding light on the movement of reading practices as we move across the 19th and the 20th centuries. And so for me, though the three of them really lead at the Reading Practices Hub, it's the one that I find most significant for me in the work that I've done. And so I want to make reference to the three of them because they're the real heart and soul of that. I consider myself a medievalist. And so by way of answering Jude's question, there's a little bit of autobiography I think I should share. So I consider myself a medievalist with a focus on legal history, having done the JD and the law degree one way, and then the PhD into history in another, trying to blend these two different disciplines that oftentimes are quite distinct in the way they are organized institutionally at universities, but even in the subject matter here at in the way we think about Islam and Islamic studies. When I first started grad school and wrote my first book, I think I would have found Jude's question obvious and clear. Islamic legal texts were those that the community of jurists at the time considered canonical to the study and promulgation of Islamic law. It was a bit teleological, but that might have been how I would have addressed it. As I've continued my work in the field, it's become increasingly clear that to adopt this position, of course, is to give far too much credence to the constitutive power of pre-modern jurists in crafting their field, or in other words, to indulge a kind of legal formalism in the way we understand law. We're identifying the Islamic by the way those within the field are defining the Islamic. It's far too deferential, plays into a particular canonical politics. Now, last fall, we had Khalid Fahmy from Cambridge University speak to us as our visiting faculty member about his most recent work on forensic science and the law in late 19th and early 20th century Egypt. And in the course of his lecture and master classes that he gave, he raised important questions about the ways in which what might fall within the realm of the Islamic might also be deeply influenced by the kinds of politics, economics, cultural inferences, and trends that are no less part of how I also teach law to law students today in Canada. In discussions with Jeannie and Haytham and Suzanne, this hub takes shape, noting that this contestation about the Islamic occupies not just the realm of law, but literature as well. Even the very category of literature, Michael Allen's work In the Shadow of World Literature, Hoda Shakri's work on the literary Quran, one of the more recent works, both of these, for instance, remind us that the way we understand the Islamic, whether in the category of law or in literature, is part of a larger historical project that connects the medieval past to the modern period. And as the secular has increasingly informed the category, for instance, of what is literary, that history and politics occupies a space in the very labeling of a textual tradition as Islamic or not, and allows that labeling to be deployed in unique ways. Each hub is exploring an aspect of that, whether it's Muslims as readers, thinking about how Muslims themselves leverage, deploy their own textual tradition to police their own communities, the state, which Youssef will speak about more directly, as we think about the state and its use of the textual tradition in the context of, let's say, terrorism prosecutions. Anthropology obviously has a lot to offer. Neda will speak to that. Let me just conclude. One of the what troubles me and where I think I locate myself in this conversation is as I think about the medieval imaginary of the text, for instance, and the law in particular. What I find fascinating are the implicit epistemological assumptions about the world. And so in the summer, I have a book coming out with Cambridge on jurisdiction, looking at the international child abduction issues that go on in the world today, but locating it within a more medieval context of how did medieval Muslims think about space and territory as a matter of legal mapping, recognizing that as much as there's a long historiography of the jurist as not politically engaged, that doesn't mean the law isn't already embedded with a series of political implications around who and what the rightful ruler is, where the rightful ruler is, and how we define the distinctions between the two with borders along the way. At the same time, though, we see terrorism trials today. In Toronto, a number of years ago, there was a set of trials of young men arrested at the so-called Toronto 18 for alleged conspiracy to commit terrorist acts. And what's fascinating, but also troubling, is the way in which the law enables litigators without any expertise effectively to litigate Islamic texts, an Islamic textual tradition without expertise. And so this textual tradition gets deployed in a variety of ways, whether by the state in these contexts of terror trials, or by medieval Muslims themselves as they're thinking about border crossings. And so these are just a couple things that I think about. But I leave it to my colleagues to offer their thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Emon. But Dr. Ruba Kana'an, maybe you can go next.
Thank you so much, Joud, and thank you so much, Anver, and Youcef, for bringing together this forum, Reading Muslims as a way for us to bring together the different ways in which we're looking at this relationship between textuality and Islam, textuality and Islamic studies, and what does that mean. I'm going to share with you some thoughts based on the project that I'm working on, my book on the Friday Mosque. And I want to start with an anecdote from at the time that I was a graduate student at Oxford, when the City Council was making a population study explaining how they examined the city was making a population study to explain how they estimated the number of Muslims in the city. The council officer reported that they went to mosques on Friday, counted footwear on the shelves, and multiplied that with the average size of a Muslim family. Of course, one does not know where to start with all the assumptions and stereotypes embedded in this statement. But for now, I'll just highlight the one assumption, which is that all male Muslims perform Friday prayer now, just as they must have done always. After all, Friday prayer is an obligation in the Quran, and Friday mosques or jamas are the most celebrated monuments in majority Muslim nation states and amongst Muslim diasporas. Now, I want to contrast this anecdote from, say, 20 years ago with a fatwa about the performance of Friday prayer dating to the 14th century. In a response to a question about whether 40 prisoners can perform Friday prayer in a prison, the Sunni jurist as-Subki answered that actually it's not permissible and that they should pray only regular noon prayers. He explains that even though the prisoners may be pious individuals who fulfill the conditions for Friday prayer, and just a reminder that the conditions for Friday prayer is being male, being legally sound, being legally mature, being of a sound mind, being Muslim and being free, and being amongst a group of 40 people who fulfill these conditions. So he says that they can't pray Friday prayer, and that they should do the Zohr prayer. He explains that the purpose of Friday prayer, and I quote, is making manifest the symbol of Islam, or the notion of iqamat al-shi'ar. Therefore, he argues, Friday prayer is distinguished from regular prayer by being performed in only one place in the city, as there can only be one symbol of Islam. So my current research sits at the intersection of these two narratives. It is steeped in a vast textual archive. It mainly answers the question, why is it that there is a limited number of Friday mosques in the pre-modern Muslim context, and why are Friday mosques ubiquitous in our modern times? The book that I'm working on shows that towards the end of, well, until the end of the 13th century, so the first 600 years of Islam, there were very few Friday mosques, and certainly no more than a Friday mosque in each city. Practically, this means that unlike today, only a limited number of people, men, were physically able to fit into a mosque or spill over in the surrounding area in order to perform Friday prayer. The number of Friday mosques increased gradually between the 13th and 16th century, and then increased dramatically after that. The way I trace this development and explain the change from a single Friday mosque in the city to every mosque becoming a Friday mosque, so blurring those lines between masjid and jama, is through the rich and abundant legal texts on Friday prayer. Just a caveat, there is very, very limited legal texts on Friday mosques, and it doesn't say anything about when and where Friday mosques are being built. The texts that are relevant are in a different place. They're in the ritual section talking about Friday prayer, so in ibadat. So in addition to the really splendid architectural monuments that I work with, where each mosque is in itself a palimpsest of constructions and additions documented in texts and inscriptions, the main archives that I work with consist of two interconnected textual sources. The first is, of course, substantive fiqh manuals written by Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi scholars between the 9th and the 20th centuries. These scholars consistently discussed the conditions for Friday prayer and how, by whom, and where Friday prayer can be performed. Again, that's what usually you find in the Ibadat section in fiqh manuals. The second textual source is the many fatwas on Friday prayer. These fatwas present opinions written by legal scholars, usually in response to a live event, such as the establishment of multiple Friday mosques in the city. And indeed, we have bursts of groups of fatwas that come into the scene where muftis give reference and evidence to the building of specific Friday mosques. And this happens along the three traditions, the Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi tradition. So my reflection on these texts for the purpose of today is, I think that these texts reflect a continuous tension in reading Muslims and the reading of Muslims. I believe that this tension is both institutional and academic. Both institutions and academics, whether in Muslim majority countries or states reading their Muslim diasporas, gloss over any ontological question regarding the Friday prayer or Friday mosques. They also gloss over any differences of interpretation and practice amongst Muslims over space, time, and between the different schools of interpretation. Hence the counting footwear outside the Friday mosque. Instead, they focus on discussing the modalities of prayer, issues of gender in relationship to the mosque, and the perceived role of Friday mosques as potential venues for the dissemination of political propaganda and for recruitment. And that feeds into the points that Anver was talking about. Yet for Muslim legal scholars, these texts continue to be read as a live and continuous text, addressing the debate on the meaning and purpose of conditional on Friday prayer, the conditions of Friday prayer. The most recent sources I read for the book that I'm working on in this relation, for example, were produced by Sheikh al-Albani, who died in 1999, and by the current Mufti of the Sultanate of Oman, al-Khalili. Both texts date to the end of the 1990s. So the questions for my research, the text is a place of a continuous tension and debate, and it's an unexplored source for the area of Islamic architecture in general, but for me specifically, the Friday Mosque. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruba. Nada, if you could go next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef and Anwar, for this invitation, for bringing us together. Thank you, Ruba, for this great talk. I'm always excited to hear you talk about the Friday Mosque. It's so mind-boggling for so much we take for granted. So in the question that Youssef and Anwar posed to us, they highlighted the centrality of text to the study of Islam and Muslims. They noted that texts are used as an archive for understanding past Muslim communities and are sometimes a means to analyze Muslim practice today. In my book, God's Property, I certainly engage both of these moves. Because I do a historical anthropology of the revival of the practice of waqf, charitable endowments, in Beirut, both the texts of the Islamic legal tradition and the archive, which consists, in my case, of the local archive of the Qadi court in Beirut, which became called the Sunni Sharia court, and the Ottoman archives in Istanbul and Ankara. So both of the Islamic legal tradition as well as the archive are important sites of excavation for me to understand the way waqf was practiced and transforming during the 19th century. And of 19th century Beirut, what remains today, along with material objects, are these pieces of paper enabled by state practices of archiving and the continuity of the work of the Beirut Sharia court, because these court records, even though they're part of the archives, they're also part of the living history and practices. So sometimes people would, in disputes, go to these sigils from the 19th century. These archives were also disrupted by wars and thefts. For example, a 19th century that a local historian cites is nowhere to be found. A few pages are sometimes missing from registers. But for all the wars and the reputation of the Lebanese state, the archive is pretty extensive. According to the Islamic legal manuals dominant in Ottoman Beirut, when waqf makers endow a waqf, they surrender the ownership of property to God, making the waqf eternal and inalienable. It cannot be sold, gifted, mortgaged, or inherited. The most visible waqfs include institutions and infrastructures: mosques, shrines, madrasas, soup kitchens, fountains, wells, and even railways. But waqfs also included vast amounts of arable lands, whole villages and shops, whose revenues funded the upkeep of these institutions and the salaries of their imams, teachers, students, caretakers, etc. In Ottoman Beirut, men and women, rich and poor, surrendered the ownership of rooms and shops, houses, small pieces of land, and even trees to support the mosques and the Sufi lodges of the city and beyond, distribute bread to the poor, pay for reciters to read parts of the Quran, provide shade to passers-by, and especially support the families of founders. The modernizing reforms of both the Ottoman state and especially the French mandatory one started to introduce legislation that rendered many of these Islamic legal manuals that defined the waqf and its legal contours less relevant. So under the French mandate, which lasted from 1920 to 1943, new state laws defined time limits for family waqfs, and they facilitated, encouraged, and even forced the sale of waqfs. In some ways, this story fits the dominant narrative of the history of Islamic law under the modern state. Through its codification in the domain of personal status, the Islamic legal tradition, many observers note, has become mostly irrelevant outside of the domains of worship. Mosques, for instance, still an alive tradition. So it comes as no surprise that when Haj Tawfiq, one of my interlocutors and the director of an Islamic institute, went with some of the trustees of the Beirut Arab University to the Sharia court in the 1980s to make the university into a waqf for particular conditions I can go into in the Q&A. The sitting judge had to go to the archive, dig into the Ottoman registers, and pull out a waqf deed to follow its legal form. And all of this because waqf had not been in vogue much since the French Mandate legislation and the rule of its judges. This was even the case when these judges had a degree from a Sharia institute where they engaged the texts of the Islamic legal tradition, because the curriculum emphasizes the domains that were most relevant to the everyday life of Muslims in Lebanon today. Pecuniary practices like the waqf did not figure prominently there. However, in my intervention today, I would like to bring an ethnographic moment to make us rethink the form that an Islamic legal text takes. These texts do not exist only as books in libraries studied by expert scholars. They also appear in unexpected places, embodied in practitioners and objects. So let me illustrate very briefly. In the 1990s, after the end of the Lebanese Civil War, the reconstruction of the city center provoked considerable debate. A major grievance was the decision to expropriate all rights holders and to compensate them with shares in the stock of the company in charge of reconstruction, which was later called Solidaire. So the Director General of Islamic Waqfs administered some 56 waqfs in the city center. And I was trying to understand what had happened to them. Had they been also expropriated or not? Especially because any mention of waqfs and Solidaire to various Beiruti Sunni interlocutors often elicited disapproving headshakes and accusations. They sold the Muslims waqfs. Tant An'am, a matriarch of the Qabbanis, contesting the director's control of her family waqf, told me. Tant An'am, with her short, dark blonde dyed hair, her below-the-knee straight skirt, and her Beiruti accent, represented the disappointment of many Sunni Muslims I had talked to about the way the Director General handled the Waqf in Beirut's city center in the face of Solidaire. So the DGIW had sold what was supposed to be inalienable, these interlocutors lamented. Yet in the current legal regime governing Waqfs could be exchanged for cash. They could be returned to private property by their beneficiaries through a very simple legal process. So in fact, the DGIW hadn't done something that was illegal. Tant An'am's assumption that waqfs should not be sold, however, echoes the majority opinion in the dominant legal school in Ottoman Beirut. Of course, Tant An'am never quoted Ibn Abidin, the famous late Ottoman Damascene jurist, for example, or any Islamic legal opinion on the matter of the impossibility of the sale of waqfs. But her outrage about the sale of waqf asks us to pause before thinking that Islamic legal texts, when they're not taught or applied by the state, cease to matter. They continue to exist in embodied forms in practitioners like Tant An'am. While I've given here an example of the way Islamic texts appear today to try and push us to think of the meaning of text. So we're assuming texts have physicality, and I'm trying to say maybe we can also think about other ways that we can think about text. I would also like to end with an invitation to also problematize and think critically of the practice of reading, which and what it involves, as in the title of the project, Reading Muslims. I was reminded of this question of what reading means when I was reading Fabio Vicini's new book, which is called Reading Islam. So it's kind of, everything is about reading. But reading is a central practice of the communities that Fabio studies, which are the communities of the Nur movement in Turkey, whose revivalism is originally inspired by Said Nursi and his main book, if you will, the Risale-i-Nur. Reading for members of these communities reflects a modernist view of knowledge that prompts, direct scrutiny and access to the sources. So they're very much engaged in this very modernist discourse, as Laradib calls it, authenticated Islam, as Vicini likes to say. But the reading practice, which can be individual, is different from the traditional authorized transmission by authorized readers, where we think about how a reading used to happen, Vicini tells us. However, he shows us that the reading is associated with the practice of tafakkur, which is meditative reflection, drawing on Sufi practices. So here, members are not engaged in drawing inferences from the natural world as evidence of God's existence, or in drawing a set of logical consequences from empirical observation. Rather, there's an inductive reasoning based on the thoughtful observance of natural phenomena to reach the conclusion of the existence of God. So here, reading is associated with a practice of reflection that's quite different from both social and individual practices of reading. And so I hope that these two small interventions contribute to us opening up some thinking about what both texts and reading mean. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moumtaz. And now we turn to Dr. Youssef Sufi.
Thank you so much, Joud. Let me begin by saying that by training, I'm a historian of classical Islamic law. My participation in reading Muslims Hub on anti-Muslim racism and national security is a result of my new book project that analyzes a Muslim community's experience of the war on terror by examining the traumatic event of the radicalization of 3 of its members in 2007. Within my work and those of my Hub colleagues, Islamic texts figure in various ways. But many of us, including Anver, in a recent publication on the Toronto 18, have noted how the Quran and classical texts are often interpreted in simplistic ways in the bureaucratic, parliamentary, and court context of Western European and North American states. The richness of contested Muslim interpretations of scripture is often missed in favor of discourses deemed useful for policy recommendations on how to govern a suspect minority. Today, I'd like to speak about one consequence of such simplistic interpretations of scripture for my own research. I use an archival source from my current book project to show how state interpretations of scripture have covered up the complexity of Canadian Muslims' experiences, interpretations, and actions when faced with the radicalization of one of their community members during the War on Terror. The archive in question is an email sent by a distraught mother to her son in March of 2007. It is a response to what was a nightmarish situation. A week earlier, her son, along with 2 of his friends, left Winnipeg, Manitoba, for the region of Waziristan in northeastern Pakistan, a region known for jihadist groups opposing NATO's presence across the border in Afghanistan. When they left, these three friends, Muhannad Al-Farak, Farid Imam, and Maywan Yar, were undergraduate students at the University of Manitoba, and by all accounts, were living an exemplary life of service to their Muslim community and to their wider Canadian society. The mother likely suspected that her son had left Canada to join a jihadist organization. She writes, "My son, Habibi, my beloved, I hope you are feeling well. My prayers go out to you every time I pray, 5 times a day, and when I hear the adhan, the call to prayer. Sometimes in the middle of the night, please send a message." When I first encountered this letter, I was gripped by it, but I could not place my finger on why. There was something about the image of a mother using overtly religious language when faced with her son's potential religious radicalization that seemed both completely sensible to me as a Muslim and as a historian of religion, but also jarring as a member of the Canadian public. But by placing the email within the history of the War on Terror, it became possible for me to make sense of my initial intuitions. After 9/11, Western states had adopted 2 postures towards Islam and consequently Islamic scripture. In the first years of the War on Terror, the state's primary view of Islam was one of suspicion. The suspicion was intimately linked to a view of Muslims as unable to read scripture in critical or secular ways. Talal Asad pointed this out quite clearly back in 2003, writing, quote, "The present discourse about the roots of Islamic terrorism in Islamic texts trails 2 intriguing assumptions. A, that the Quranic A, that the Quranic texts will force Muslims to be guided by it, and B, that Christians and Jews are free to interpret the Bible as they please. The quote continues a little later, a magical quality is attributed to Islamic religious texts, for they are said to be both essentially univocal, their meaning cannot be subject to dispute, just as fundamentalists insist, and infectious, except in relation to the Orientalist, who is, fortunately for him, immune to their dangerous power. End quote. This assumption about uncritical Muslim readings of scripture and classical texts endures today among various think tanks, political parties, and bureaucratic bodies. But as Arun Kunani notes, alongside the view that Islamic scripture breeds violence, another view of Islam has emerged and taken hold during the Obama years. This view of Islam sees the Muslim majority as moderate in its interpretation of scripture and sees radical interpretations to be a product of a fringe, totalitarian reading of the faith, often labeled Salafi jihadism. This view of Islam gives some shelter to Muslim communities who are able to say that their faith is not intrinsically violent. At the same time, it suffers from two drawbacks for those very Muslim communities. First, the line between radical and moderate is slippery, depending on who draws it. North American and European Muslim communities often again come under the microscope as possible radical sympathizers. Second, under this reading, Islam becomes an instrument in the state's war on terror. Moderate readings of Islam become the basis for countering extremism. In short, then, the Islamic tradition at the level of Western states has been rendered either an object of suspicion or instrumentalization. The part of me that found the mother's email jarring stemmed from the gap between a state-centered reading of Islam, one embraced by radicalization studies and prominently featured in media, and what the email reveals about the mother's own relationship to her faith. For the mother, the Islamic tradition is neither suspect nor can it be reduced to its instrumental use. Rather, Islam is a language that allows her to be and to act in the world. The mother sees the calamity of her son's disappearance as a spiritual test, drawing on the prominent Islamic teaching that life in its entirety is a trial in which believers should expect hardships. Quranic texts speak of the loss of a beloved or the threat to their safety as a particularly difficult test. In these moments of hardship, the proper response is to turn to God, not only for help, but for spiritual growth. In a time of hardship, the mother increases her acts of piety. Her son's disappearance kindles in her the virtues of hope and trust in God's mercy. At every call to prayer in the middle of the night and away from the gaze of all, she seeks nearness to God. But the mother does not leave things solely up to God. Her email is also an attempt to directly reach out to her son. She explicitly informs her son of her worship as a way to communicate her love and her worry for him. Perhaps her words will make him come back. After all, the Prophet Muhammad taught that paradise is attained through duty and care of one's mother. She also wants him to take comfort in the hope that God will answer his mother's prayers. She knows her son shares a religious vernacular with her. They draw on the same reference and same belief in a benevolent God who cares for his creation. Their arguments are therefore mutually intelligible. To come back to our wider question, what role then do texts play in research on anti-Muslim racism and national security? In my own research, assumptions about Muslim texts affect not only how the state deals with its Muslim populations, but also what experiences of the Muslim are available to historians and social scientists today. The state's ability to shape the public sphere through its relationship to the media and its funding of academic projects impact the questions posed and answers given about Muslims' relationship to radicalization. Following Spivak's question of the possibility of recovering subaltern voices on the margins of society, I'm led to wonder in what ways the shaping of the public sphere distorts our understanding of Muslim experiences and interpretations during the war on terror. I also wonder in what ways it has shaped Muslim communities themselves who have been unable to use an Islamic idiom to grieve the loss of fellow community members without being accused of sympathies with extremism. Part of what I hope the Reading Muslims project can do is critique simplistic readings of the nexus between Islamic radicalization and textuality, so as to uncover historical archives that have been neglected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef. So I will open now the floor to our discussants, our panelists, for a conversation. If we can maybe go for 15 minutes rather than 20, just to allow more time for the audience to ask questions. You are free to kind of take it over as you like. So I'll start with maybe Dr. Emon, and then it can be a more organic conversation amongst you guys. So please.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to point out a couple of things and emphasize a few points that my colleagues have brought to the fore that I think are important and speak to the nature of this project. Ruba talks about, of course, the double valence of the title, Reading Muslims, where Muslims are readers themselves. They engage in practices of reading and from that construe meaning. But of course, Muslims are also read, and it's in the passive tense of that construction of the title that we beg the question, who's doing the reading? And of course, there's the question of whether it's the state, whether it's others who are watching, right? And in the post 9/11 context, this has become a much more significant feature. What I'd like to just locate is one question or one point that I'm sure many are thinking is that, it's not like we've lost sight of the text in Islamic studies. We all know it's a literate tradition. We all know it has a vast corpus of literary genres. We all know that. We've inherited this. We've maybe seen moves closer to that direction, farther away from that direction. We've seen the bringing of anthropology in the last few decades, particularly with Talal Assad's contribution and those who adhere to that approach. We've seen different ways in which the text also features historically, and Brinkley Messick's work on historical anthropology is another. And so the project doesn't try to do the obvious as saying texts are relevant. That would be ridiculous. But it is a question, and this is where I think the Reading Practices Hub offers, at least me, some insight, is texts have afterlives, as to invoke Walter Benjamin. And so one of the things I like to ask my co-panelists about is the different afterlives that we're contending with that we think have not yet been fully explored in the context of even just how we construe the field of Islamic studies more broadly, or a research trajectory that might come out of the Institute. As a director of the Institute, I'm always trying to think about what the kind of trajectories we can create are. And so I want to pose the question to my colleagues and say, what are the afterlives that we're contending with that we haven't yet integrated well across the different disciplines? And I raise this question in light of a following observation that I have. As I mentioned, I sort of shamefully name dropped a book that's coming out this summer on parental child abduction, which is an issue between Muslim majority jurisdictions and others. But the line of inquiry that I found curious is that if you look at a lot of comparative law scholarship, the assumption on Islamic law is that it's status-based. Yeah. Islam travels with the Muslim wherever he or she goes. And I was curious why that's the assumption. Where do they get that from? And as you look into the construction of that literature, you see that they're reflecting on the fact that by the mid-20th century, many Muslim majority states had been enacting family law statutes as the one site of Islamic family law that had also been there during the colonial period when Britain was in India and elsewhere. So family law becomes this unique site while all other areas, commercial and others, gets overwritten. And so what's fascinating is the way now Muslim majority states like Qatar and the UAE that just issued family law statutes in 2005, when they articulate their family law statutes, when there's a conflict of jurisdictions, like in a parental child abduction case, they don't recognize their legal other. If I have a custody agreement from the United States, but I'm in the UAE, it's as if there was no custody agreement at all. They can't see that US order. The same would happen in Jordan if it was a Canadian order or whatnot. And my question is, why can't they see it? Why? Because when it comes to family law, status was everything. If you are Muslim, then no other law matters. Nothing else matters. But if it's a contract for trade, that's a different story, at least historically. Today, of course, the UAE, which is one of my case studies, has a diverse range of jurisdictional play, whether it's the Jebel Ali Free Trade Zone, whether it's the Dubai International Financial Center, where jurisdiction is a side of play. but not Islamic family law. And so when I think about this idea in contemporary scholarship that Islam is status-based as a legal tradition, on the one hand, I'm seeing it through the lens of Western scholars writing about a comparative law, but they're getting it from institutional structures in the Muslim majority world, different kinds of inheritance structures of how that tradition has been transmitted over time, and the way aspects of that tradition, specifically family law, coordinate or don't coordinate with commercial anti-terrorism financing or other kinds of regimes that are currently part of the state apparatus. And so when I look at an Islamic text and I think about the question of, let's say, parental child abduction, it has, in that specific context, so many different afterlives given, or different meanings given who I'm talking to, if it's a comparative law scholar, if it's a state bureaucrat in a Muslim majority state, if it's a judge trained in one tradition versus another. And so it's in that context where one text might have multiple signaling effects across different disciplines that I think this, at least for me, that's the interest that I bring in. But I leave it to my colleagues to elaborate on, how are we actually, what's the newness here around the centrality of the text?
Can I just take it from here, just to follow on the idea of this centrality of the text and who is reading the text and who is being addressed by the text? One of the things that I was fascinated with, as someone who's been working with sort of aspects of Islamic law and material culture for almost 15 years now, is how what we think of as the historic legal texts are incredibly dynamic. They're very dynamic, they're multi-centered, and they seem to me to be always contemporary. They're always dealing with what is the context, what's the audience, what is the relationship between that text, what is it, what's addressing. And of course, here I'm specifically talking about prayer, and specifically Friday prayer. How is a ruler defined? How is a city defined? How is a permission defined? So there is a set of principles within which all the focus keeps shifting. And they're very dynamic, they're multi-centered, and also they're iterative. So I think when we look at the texts, again, I'm looking specifically at things related to Friday prayer. When we look at these texts and we suddenly rob them out of this dynamism, and we suddenly canonize them. And of course, when it came to Friday prayer and Friday mosque, there were stages, and the last stage was the building codes. Building codes in the modern nation state took that dynamic Islamic law aspect of prayer and gave it a different garb that is related to space and parking spots and the distance from areas and so on. So it changed. Yet when we read, does that change mean that we stop looking at it as something that changed historically? And can't we use it as an example to say that I think in every aspect of the law, can we raise the question that in every aspect of the law was always contemporary, based on a set of principles? And I think that for me is something that I'm interested in. How do we historically read these texts, and why is it that now all the texts are read in almost a very sort of canonized, fossilized way?
Ruba, I mean, I think that's, it's a way, I mean, I think that also brings us to the way of reading and, how do we read texts really, and what do we read them for? And I think that's something that Youssef also was bringing up. And to me, partly what was interesting is to look at the difference between going back to these texts in different ways, whether it is, Kana'an, who's just citing a dominant opinion, which is actually used in a way to challenge the the dispossession of Muslims, whereas here the fixity of text in the case of Youcef, for example, is used to the contrary to actually accuse them. So I think I was wondering how, I mean, the way these texts can be used in very different ways, even how the fixity itself sometimes can actually be helpful. I mean, I know that we see how sometimes it is used very much terribly, and but yeah, so it's just something that came to mind in relation to the kind of neoliberal kind of dispossessions that were going on, and the kind of idea that there's a certain sacredness that is associated with waqf or whatever that comes in.
Yeah, I think from this discussion, what I'm enjoying the most is how the different examples that have been brought up speak to Anver's point about the different afterlives of the texts, right? So thinking about who reads the text about the Friday Mosque today, thinking about the elites who read certain classical Islamic texts versus common people. I hadn't, you know, we often think about Islam as embodied practice. We know that from the Anthropology of Islam, but it wasn't until I heard Nada speaking about the example of waqf that I thought about how these texts, for people who aren't reading them, but texts from the past, are embodied today as well, and how you know, and it goes back to Enver's point too about personal status, where that might carry over into a person's sensibilities today, like a law of the past might carry over into somebody's sensibilities today, even if the state's undertaken a project of reform, and even if the state has different legislation. So it adds a certain messiness to our historiography.
I wanted to ask a question, and you know, one of the things, and this may be more for Nada, but I know this is, you know, I know Joud is engaged in this. So Joud, I hope that you, though as facilitator, I think I'm going to put you on the spot first, and then Nada, because Nada's been on the spot a lot. But I also want to think about the way anthropology itself has been evolving, right? So one of the hubs that we're having that Nada is involved in is the Anthropology of Islam Hub. Basit Iqbal, who's on the session, is also involved in that. So a quick shout out to Basit, who's our new colleague down the street from us, and we're glad to have him here.
Amira is also in the second screen.
Oh, Amira, wonderful. And Amira's here too. So these three lead that conversation. And so, you know, this also might be a broader conversation for Amira and Basit to join in. But, you know, we've seen in many ways in North America, especially, tendencies around textuality distinguish themselves as between the more traditional area studies model that we inherited from the Cold War period in North America, and then Islamic studies or religious studies, which is adopted a much more anthropological orientation in the study of Islam, though that's not necessarily universal across the board. And so as we see these two polarities, and I use the polarities maybe more tongue in cheek because I understand they're not as polar or opposite as we might think. But at the same time, I'm curious for those of us thinking with anthropology, which has been so significant in contributing theoretical insight to where Islamic studies might go, where is that field, or is the study of Islam moving in this direction? I know in my conversations with some of you, we're thinking about the secular, we're thinking about theology, we're thinking about notions of orthodoxy, but I want to pose this because I suspect many on this call are also informed by that debate and those conversations that are going on. And perhaps as we begin to move to a more open conversation, this might be a fruitful way to begin that. So I'll turn it to Joud first and put her on the spot.
Well, I will, thank you, Anver. I will now use the excuse that we only have 1 minute left before we said we'd get to audience questions. But I do think that, I mean, the conversation in my sort of kind of timeline of things, in terms of bringing back texts into the study of Islam is really Talal Asad's intervention. And I feel, I mean, as many who are involved in the discipline recognize, it was, you know, a watershed moment of really radically transforming how one could study Islam, what texts meant, how they could be engaged, what practices mattered when what practices were backgrounded. But I also wonder what is coming up, and I hope that that's something that the Reading Muslims project can showcase, because I mean, it's been, as we mentioned earlier, you know, Asad wrote this in the 80s. And so we've come a long way since then, quite a few decades. And there's been a lot of work inspired by him and by Sabah Mahmoud and Hirschkind and all the other kind of anthropology of Islam discipline. And of course, then, you know, retorts to that and critiques of it. And I feel like we're in many ways moving, not beyond it, but that the conversations are changing. And so the sort of common sense of Islamic texts mattering is somewhat, you know, more taken for granted, I would say. Even as I mean, hopefully we'll explore more in this project. I mean, I've mentioned this, and we've had the conversations, Nada and I and others, about, you know, what anthropologies of Islam really closely engage texts. There are a few, but still not as many as I think there can be. And so I'm definitely excited to see what comes out of this project and kind of finding ethnographies that explore, you know, various aspects of the Muslim world and Islam, but not necessarily kind of highlighting texts themselves, but us reading texts into them and seeing where we can find texts where maybe they're not mentioned organically. But yes, I think that if that's okay for my answer for now, maybe we can turn to audience questions, because I'm sure we have a lot of them. So we've had to slightly change things up. So if you do have a question, I believe the procedure is to raise your hand, and then we will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So please go ahead and raise
if you
your hands.
prefer not to speak, you can also chat if there's anything. Send it.
That might not be possible. We might have had to change that a little bit. Yes, we'll see. Zed can help us out with that.
Sorry, Joud.
It's okay.
As some of you may have known, we were early on, we were Zoom bombed, which suggests that we're doing something important. So I'm going to take that as a wonderful, as a gratifying moment for us that we were Zoom bombed. So we've had to turn off the chat function, but if you're able to, you can direct message any of us. I know Salman Rizwan just texted me that he has a question, so I'll send that over to Joud.
Okay, great. So I think Zed can help us out with the unmuting, I believe.
Yep, so I've just, Salman, there you go.
Thank you, Zed.
First of all, thank you very much for arranging this session. It was really very, very beneficial. I'm a student of Quran and classical Arabic. I currently teach Quranic Arabic to English speaking students in Toronto area, and I am preparing for my master's in Islamic studies. Obviously, reading is one of my passions. That's why I decided to join this special group of people to learn from each one of you. My question is, how do you see the role of Arabic language in this whole discussion of reading? In my view, the Arabic language is on a decline because of the infusion of other languages. Overall, internet, if you look at the internet, the Arabic content, as according to one of the studies, is just 3% of the total content on the internet. Also, there is a lot of international words that have crept in. Not that this is a new practice, but it is, I think, on a rise. Similarly, all the major papers are written, scientific or otherwise, are also written in either Chinese or English language. So there is also a general trend in Arabic speaking, like those who have native language as Arabic, to understand and learn more of the other foreign languages. And this is causing, and on top of everything else, now we have social media where you have special codes and memes and emoticons, and nobody wants to write what they really want to write. So I am a great fan, and I love Arabic language. I wish it was my mother tongue, but it is not the case. But I'm trying to get more and more of it. So please allow me to ask that, what do you see the role of Arabic language in reading overall? And do you also agree with the fact that the texts, Islamic texts or otherwise, are best read and understood in their own language? That's my thought, but please enlighten me with yours. Thank you.
Can I suggest that I, in my role as just a professor, I'm a bit of a law professor, so I tend to use the Socratic method, and I want to introduce you, sir, to Adil Mawani, who is a doctoral student here at the University of Toronto and part of the Reading Practices Hub. I'm giving a little bit of I'm about to put him on the spot, but I'm giving him a moment to get his thoughts together. Adil actually is developing a series of interventions that are really about kind of the language politics associated with the study of Islam. And so I'm going to ask him to share some insights, because he works within the South Asian context, thinks about Urdu in particular as a language of Islam. But I suspect that, and he brings some phenomenal intellectual insights on that. I think Ruba wants to get in on that as well. So, but I'm gonna turn it to Adil, because he's gonna be writing and writing to this very specific issue. So Adil, I'm putting you on the spot. I hope that was enough preliminary conversations to get you ready, and take it away. And Salman, if I could ask you to mute yourself just so we don't get some background noise.
Yeah, I will do that.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adil Mawani. I'm a doctoral candidate at the DSR, Department for Study of Religion. I am a bit on the spot. I wasn't expecting to speak, but I could give a very short preview. We're working on this e-zine or the blog entry. I'll give you a short preview of what I'm working on for that. I'm looking at some of the writings in the Sindhi language, in the pre-colonial and the colonial switch, and especially looking at how the manuscripts became written books. And I'm sort of fascinated by the tradition or the introduction of book technology, printing technology in South Asia. What's interesting is it happens very late in the world context, happens in the 19th century. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how it happens. Of course, there's a huge colonial intervention. So I'm looking at what does it mean for the British to be there? Why are they involved? When do these religious texts get converted into books? And I would love to pick this question up to others. The question of literacy and access to written texts. I mean, it's a huge underlying question. I'm surprised no one's brought it up yet, but in the context of South Asia, there's a lot of knowledge production and transference. Of course, it happens orally, but this is a question I'm wondering about. In the issue or the topic of reading Muslims, like literally reading, is sort of a big thing. So I'm wondering about languages. You brought up the question of Arabic. There's other languages, Persian in South Asia, how those languages sort of transfer, how certain languages have authority. There's often a contestation between local, regional languages. So that's sort of what I'm working on. And I think an assumed thing is texts from manuscripts to books and to print. Those are sort of the themes and the questions I'm trying to work into the first blog post. But I hope others have things to say about that.
Thank you, Adil. Very well done on the spot. So maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions in a row and then give the panelists a chance to respond to that. That could maybe make it move a bit quicker. So again, whoever has a question, please raise your hand and Zed will go ahead and unmute you. So we have Nahid who has a question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for this really very engaging conversation. So my question, so I've done some classical Abbasid period work, and also now I'm moved on to German court cases relating to terrorism suspects. And so I was wondering if you've come across some advice in the texts or the practices you've engaged with that tell you how not to read a text. You know, what is there in a text that protects Muslims? Because in the current mode we're in, it's almost as if the text is being used, Islamic texts are being used against Muslims. And it's almost as if it's almost like a catch-22 that we want to refer to the text, but the text is being used against many of the most vulnerable in our communities. So is there some advice you feel like, you know, how not to read a text, you know, because otherwise I think we tended to be in a kind of democratic kind of mode to say people, yes, I mean, Muslim texts should speak to all of us. You know, it's true, you should be qualified to read them, but, you know, as long as you have this pious mind, they should speak to all of us. But is there some kind of guidelines you've come across of like how not to read a text, you know? And I'm referring to what Nada had earlier said in terms of the fixation of a text. Is this something that helps us fixate it so that it can do its kind of protective duty? Thank you.
Thank you, Nahid. Wonderful. So one thing to maybe mention is if you have someone specific you'd like to address your question, that's something worth mentioning. And then also we have the next, is there someone that specific you're interested? No? Or to the floor? Okay, great. So we'll have Sami Ayub next and then Amin. So Sami, please.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. It's good to see Anver and the group here. So I think my question is the following. Is the issue of reading Muslims, is it internally or externally raised? And so are we responding to certain conditioning around us, especially in North American context, or something else going on that we're trying to address within the community itself? What is the end goal and vision behind reading texts, especially if you go to Egypt, go to Pakistan or India and Muslims, for example, and raise the same questions? I'm not sure the responses would be, or how, okay, so how this question can be raised in these different Muslim locales, for example, that might not be affected by the type of narrative or the rhetoric about terrorism, for example, if we're in Canada or the United States. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you, Sami. So next we have Amin's question.
Hi, assalamu alaikum. I'm sorry because I can't turn on my camera, just because I'm in a small flat and my daughter is running all over the place. But this is Amin al-Yousfi, and I'm very happy to see people that I know and I haven't seen for 2 years now since the AAA conference. I mean, Joud, Basit, Khadija, Nada. So it's really great to see you. And I haven't listened to the first presentation, so I listened only to Nada and Youcef's presentations. And one of the things that were absent, I think, is the question of language. Because as you all know, and as you know, anthropologists know, it's languages constitutes a sort of intervenes in reality. And since I'm right now also working on a similar project, which is called Ethnography of the Quran at the University of Chester, and where I'm studying a group of people who are reading Quran and several other texts in the UK, and I'm spending time with them also as a student, trying to embody that those texts. The question of language, I find that was central, and you know, not just related to the question of semiotic ideology as developed by Keane and others, or you know, what the so-called modern linguistic ideology, but you know, something similar to what Groening, if you know her, she's a young scholar at the KU Leuven, mentioned regarding her study of people studying the Quran in Belgium, where she says that it reveals a sort of an embodiment that goes beyond the embodiment, which is that language itself is an embodiment of something else. In other terms, if we say reading text, are we talking only about reading text, or are we talking about reading the language? And in which sense the language there is related, for example, to the whole questions of kalam, For instance, and I'm talking here about the question of Quran. Is Kalamullah the language, or is it the words in the Quran, or is it the Quran, or is it only what is in the Mus'haf, or is it the meaning of the words which are in the Quran? And that whole intersection between theology and anthropology here, regarding the question of language, because we're talking about reading the text, I find it fascinating. And this is where I think we lack that certain interaction between Islamic philosophers of language, people like Izutsu or others, and like us, anthropologists of text, who are trying really to incorporate the text while doing fieldwork and not just doing something like what Shahab Ahmed did, which is just reading the text basically and not doing any fieldwork. So Allahu Alam, I mean, it's just something that I'm asking, and I hope that I can learn from you regarding what you think about this question, which I myself still struggling with. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Emon. Wonderful to have you with us. So I'll open the floor to the panelists. We have about 10 minutes, so hopefully we can get through everything and maybe even get a question at the end as well.
I'm happy to start if that's all right. But I know Ruba had her hand up earlier with respect to Salman's question, so I'm mindful of that. So let me just quickly respond to a couple of thoughts. So, to Salman, but also to Adil. First of all, thank you, Adil, for allowing me to put you on the spot. That was wonderful, and I appreciate you tolerating my Socratic tendencies. But, Salman, I think that from what Adil was saying is like, there are important questions about the very idea of literacy, and Emon raised this issue as well. But there's a larger question to be had about what languages are Islamic, right? The label Islamic is oftentimes presumed to be of Arabic, or Arabic plays a central role, but so too has Persian literature, so too does Urdu literature, and these different genres aren't oftentimes as central. And so while we might center the Quran as a site of Islamicity, what happens to these other language traditions? One language tradition that we oftentimes don't think about is Bahasa in Indonesia. And where is that language in our contemporary parlance? And I will leave it to others to talk about the ongoing debates within the American Academy of Religion and elsewhere on Arab centricism or Arab centrality. And I don't want to get into that particular debate. I know that many of us probably have observed that conversation. I'm not sure that's the helpful way to go for it, but I'm open to having that conversation. Nahed, do texts have limiting devices? I was talking to one of our hub leaders, Nadia Marzouki, and I were talking about, one of the problems in Europe is that the texts do become so central in these national security ventures that in fact you want to get away from the text. The last thing you want to do is have the text because they're read with a certain kind of determinacy. You can see it also in North America in the way you have anti-Sharia bills and the way they read what Sharia is, or national security policies that look at jihad texts out of context, right? So I take the point that the text sometimes becomes the problem, but it's only a problem in the national security context by the prosecutor, right? And so the question is there something about the institution of national security, the institution of even the cross-examination, or the leading question is one thing that I'm interested in, is there a problem in the way we teach law students about leading questions and the assumptions that they're able to make about a state of facts that are much more complicated. So I'm not sure it's just about the text. I do think it's about the way the text is situated within a discipline. Sami, and I'll leave with Sami and Amin's question. I'm going to leave it to others because I'm not sure I'm in the best position to address that. But I found your internal-external distinction quite interesting because it operates in space, but I'm not sure if it operates in space or in terms of a geography. But what was interesting to me is while on the one hand, I take your point that the national security terrorism conversation seems distinctive to North America as opposed to what you say in Egypt. I'm not so sure it is. If you look at, for instance, Al-Hidayah, the institute in the UAE, it's the leading multilateral organization on CVE funded by the United Arab Emirates, located within the Gulf, promulgated by the diplomatic corps of Saudi Arabia and others. these are conversations that are coming out of there, that are funded out of there. So Central Asian money is funded, Central Asia is peppered by programs coming out of the Gulf focused on anti-terrorism. When these countries engage in international transactions, financing, banking, they're subject to Financial Action Task Force guidelines, which are also oriented around anti-terrorism. So I'm not convinced that that's actually right, at least at the state level. Maybe we're talking at different scales. But the nice thing is about the Reading Muslims project is that it allows for this movement between communities that police themselves through reading and others that police the communities. And it's in the double valence of the Reading Muslims title that we allow for movement, noting that the text moves itself in its significance. And so I'm going to call into question the internal external and some of the presumptions in your question, because I don't think factually I can agree with them, but I'll leave it to the rest of my colleagues to respond.
Ruba, you also wanted to go. Do you want to go ahead first, or how should I do it? Just to follow up on that question, I mean, I do think despite the kind of predominance of the discourse on war and terrorism, etc., but I still think that there are certain practices that for example, people doing waqf in Beirut are not necessarily concerned with in terms. And so I think there is certainly different communities who have different interests, and so these questions might not be relevant. And I want to keep space for us to be able to not have an American-centric or kind of vision of where everything is determined by the agenda set in here. So that's something I strongly kind of sit with, and that's what I was trying to kind of talk about, the difference between the way a fixed text has been mobilized in Lebanon versus in the context of that Youssef was talking about. I was trying to allude to these differences. And just to the question of language and Emon's question, I just wanted to say that I feel like perhaps in your case, there is a certain particularity because you are dealing with the Quran. And I think that's where the question of language becomes even more, I think, salient. I mean, the Arabic and the fact that is something, it's so essential to the text. And so in many debates, at least. And so I feel like I'm definitely much more willing to open the text to whatever exists in different languages than just Arabic, and I think that's definitely necessary. But yeah, I think the centrality of and essentiality of Arabic in that case perhaps has to do with a particularity.
I actually also wanted to talk about the language itself and the use of language, because of the nature of my project, where I was looking at Sunni, Shia, and Ibadi texts at different periods of time, I ended up looking at fatwas specifically in Arabic, Ottoman, which is a language I studied, I know, and Farsi, which is a language I struggle with extensively, and realized that yes, there is in a sense, the language of ethos and the language of law has some Arabic roots in it, but it doesn't translate, and some concepts get a different use throughout. So it's not enough to know Arabic, in my experience, but also it's not enough to know Farsi. So for example, I was reading a 16th century fatwa written in Farsi related to Friday prayer, and then I was reading the historian who wrote about it, and then that historian is using a term which was translated into English. So I was reading actually the English translation and then going back to the Farsi text, and the English translation included a term that I knew is a legal term and is by the 16th century an obsolete legal term. And if I didn't have that knowledge from reading those Arabic fatwas in the beginning, I wouldn't have been able to realize that actually there is a major misunderstanding of these fatwas in the late 16th, early 17th century about Friday prayer in Iran. So I don't know that we can talk about the text in absolute terms, that Arabic is enough or translation is enough. It is what what specialized language it is, and being able to move between them. I don't think it's an easy thing, and translation is interpretation, and that is the problem that we have. So I don't think it is helpful to only know Arabic, but it seems to me the specific terms and specific language related to that field, that based on my experience in sort of reading Farsi fatwas.
I know we don't have much time left, but if I could just say quickly, I think the question of Arabic really matters when we think about the afterlives of these texts. When I think of my particular research project, one of the things that matters to me is trying to understand what ideas, what literature that these three men who left for Pakistan were exposed to, and were central in their way of thinking. And certainly the fact that they didn't know Arabic. One of them did come from an Arab family, but his schooling had been in English, and he at best could get by in colloquial Arabic. And the fact that those three men didn't have access to classical texts, or to even the abundance of texts that exist in languages spoken by a large Muslim community. You know, thinking about the 2000s, there aren't a lot of texts on Islam that are available to Anglophones in Canada. And so that fact was huge in shaping those three men. So, I mean, that's specific to my research, but it highlights the question of the aftermath of texts. Who's able to read them? And I think the question of language really does matter in shaping who reads what.
Thank you all. So I believe we're out of time, as much as we would like to take more questions. I want to thank you all firstly, thank our panelists, Dr. Anver Emon, Dr. Ruba Kana'an, Dr. Nada Moumtaz, and Dr. Youssef Sufi, for sharing with us their research and their insights. Thank you also to the Kana'an Fund for providing the funding which makes these conversations possible. And finally, thank you to our audience for their insightful questions, their generous engagement. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation and hope you'll stay tuned and involved with the many upcoming things that Reading Muslims has in store. And as Zed has posted in the chat, we'll be launching a website in early February, which is very soon. And we will also have a newsletter, so please do sign up. The link is in the chat if you'd like to do so. Thank you all again.